The 15 minutes Cassius Clay sat alone in a Miami Beach hotel room, staring at his reflection and deciding whether to destroy everything he'd just won. Nobody was watching. In 2 hours, he'd walk into a press conference as the new heavyweight champion of the world. And reporters would ask him the question they'd been asking for weeks: are you really a black Muslim? And in those 15 minutes of silence, a 22-year-old man had to choose between the name that had made him famous and the identity that made him free. What happens when becoming who you are means killing who everyone thinks you should be? February 25, 1964, 10 o'clock in the morning, and the sunlight coming through the hotel window felt accusatory, like it was demanding answers Cassius wasn't ready to give. The room was modest: a bed, a desk, a mirror that reflected a face the world had just started to recognize. Last night, he'd done the impossible, beaten Sonny Liston, the most feared man in boxing. The ex-convict with dead eyes and fists like cement blocks. Liston had quit on his stool after 6 rounds, claiming a shoulder injury. And Cassius had danced around the ring screaming, "I'm the king of the world," to cameras and reporters who'd predicted his destruction. He was 22 years old, heavyweight champion, and standing at the exact moment when the American dream was supposed to feel real. Except it didn't. Because the face in the mirror, young, unmarked by the beating everyone had expected him to take, still carried a name that didn't belong to him. How long can you wear someone else's identity before it suffocates who you actually are? The papers on the desk told 2 different stories about his future. On the left, sponsorship contracts. Coca-Cola wanted him for commercials, Ford wanted him at dealership openings, breakfast cereal companies wanted his face on their boxes. Millions of dollars, contingent on one thing: staying Cassius Clay, the acceptable Negro, the Olympic hero, the kid from Louisville who'd made good and knew his place. The contracts had clauses buried in legal language but clear in intention: any controversy, any association with radical elements, any deviation from the image they'd purchased, and the money disappeared. He'd read them last night after the fight, when he should have been celebrating, and each page felt like a different kind of rope around his neck. On the right side of the desk, a single piece of paper, a letter from Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam, welcoming him officially into the faith and offering him a new name. No money attached. No endorsements. Just an identity that felt like his own. Can freedom have a price tag? And if it does, what does it mean when you can't afford it? Malcolm X had been in Miami for the fight, though he'd stayed away from the weigh-in and the arena, not wanting his presence to create problems for Cassius before the biggest night of his career. But afterward, in the early hours of the morning when the adrenaline was fading and reality was settling in, Malcolm had come to the hotel. They'd sat in this same room, and Malcolm had spoken with the precision of a man who'd thought deeply about every word. Tomorrow, they're going to ask you to choose. Not explicitly. They won't give you the dignity of a clear question, but they'll ask in every way that matters. Are you one of us or one of them? Are you Cassius Clay, the acceptable champion, or are you something else, something they didn't give you permission to be? Cassius had asked what Malcolm thought he should do, and Malcolm had smiled in that way he had sad, knowing like he was watching someone walk toward a cliff and couldn't stop them. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this: Cassius Clay is the name a slave owner gave your great-great-grandfather. You've carried it your whole life, and it's taken you to the top of the world. But it's not yours. It was never yours. And if you keep it, you'll spend the rest of your life being someone else's idea of who you should be. How do you explain to someone who's never worn chains that a name can be a chain too? The previous night, after Malcolm had left, Cassius had tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind kept circling the same question: who am I? Not who does the public think I am. Not who do the sponsors want me to be, but who am I when nobody's watching, when the cameras are off, when the performance ends? He'd been Cassius Clay for 22 years. He'd won an Olympic gold medal as Cassius Clay. He'd built a professional record as Cassius Clay. Last night, he'd become heavyweight champion as Cassius Clay. That name had opened doors, created opportunities, made him famous. But it had also required a performance. The grateful Negro, the entertaining athlete, the boy who knew not to make white people uncomfortable. And he was tired. So deeply tired of performing gratitude for being allowed to be great. Tired of smiling when reporters called him Cassius, in that particular way that made ownership clear. Tired of being told he should be happy with what he had, that wanting to define himself was ungrateful. When does gratitude become another word for submission? And can you be grateful for opportunities while also resenting the conditions attached to them? He stood up from the desk and walked to the mirror, stared at his reflection like it was a stranger he was trying to recognize. The face was his, no question. The eyes, the jawline, the expression of someone who'd spent their whole life talking themselves into confidence because nobody else would do it for them. But the name felt like a costume he was wearing. Cassius Marcellus Clay, named after a white abolitionist from the 1800s, a man who'd fought against slavery, which his parents had thought was honorable. And maybe it was. Maybe naming a black child after a white man who'd opposed slavery was a kind of hope, a reaching toward alliance, toward the idea that white people and black people could work together toward justice. But Cassius the boxer, standing in this hotel room in 1964, wasn't interested in being named after anyone's hope. He wanted a name that was just his. Not inherited from slave owners, not borrowed from abolitionists, just his. Is wanting to name yourself an act of rebellion? Or is it the most basic human right that somehow became controversial? The Nation of Islam had been courting him for over a year. He'd attended meetings, read their literature, listened to Elijah Muhammad speak about black pride, self-determination, the idea that black people didn't need white approval to have dignity. It resonated in ways his Christian upbringing hadn't, not because Christianity was wrong, but because the version of Christianity he'd grown up with had required forgiveness toward people who'd never apologized, patience toward systems that had never shown mercy, turning the other cheek toward a society that kept slapping. The Nation offered something different, the idea that black people were inherently worthy, not because white people acknowledged it, but because it was true. They taught that accepting names, identities, and limitations imposed by white supremacy was a kind of spiritual death. They taught that freedom started with rejecting everything that had been forced upon you and claiming the right to define yourself. To young Cassius, sitting in those meetings, it felt like someone had finally given him permission to be angry about things he'd been taught to accept. But permission came with a price: isolation. America in 1964 was not ready for black athletes to have political opinions, religious convictions that contradicted the mainstream, or the audacity to change their names. Was the price worth paying? That was the question he had 15 minutes to answer. 10 o'clock became 10:15. Halfway through his allotted time of solitude, before the press conference that would define everything, he thought about his mother, Odessa, who'd raised him in Louisville with love and discipline and the constant navigation required of black parents trying to keep their children safe in a hostile world. She'd taught him to be proud but careful, confident but aware. She hadn't explicitly told him not to join the Nation of Islam, but he could feel her concern, the worry that he was choosing a path that would make his life harder than it needed to be, that he was rejecting the Christianity she'd raised him in, that he was associating with people white America considered dangerous. But he also remembered something else she'd taught him, maybe without meaning to, that dignity mattered more than safety. She'd never let white store clerks disrespect her, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. She'd insisted on being called Mrs. Clay when neighbors tried to call her by her first name in that overly familiar way that was really about denying her personhood. She'd taught him, through action more than words, that how you let people treat you determines who you become. Would she understand that this decision, changing his name, claiming his identity, was just an extension of the lessons she'd taught him? Or would she see it as a rejection of everything she'd tried to give him? He thought about his father, Cassius Clay Cedar, a sign painter who'd spent his life creating advertisements for businesses that wouldn't serve black customers through the front door. His father had named him Cassius after the abolitionist, hoping the name would carry some protection, some association with white respectability that might make his son's life easier. But his father had also filled his childhood with stories of black greatness. African kings and queens, civilizations that had existed before slavery, a history that textbooks ignored. His father had been the first person to tell him he could be champion of the world, back when that seemed like impossible dreaming. Would his father understand this choice? Or would he see it as throwing away the very thing the name was to provide? A path through white America that didn't require constant battle. The generational divide was real. His parents had survived by finding ways to exist within the system. He was part of a generation that was starting to question whether existing within the system was enough, whether survival was the same as living, whether you could ever truly be free while playing by rules designed to keep you contained. When does the survival strategy of one generation become the prison of the next? 10:30. 5 minutes left before he needed to leave for the press conference. His hands were sweating slightly, not from fear but from the weight of irrevocability. Once he walked into that room and declared himself Muhammad Ali, or even just declared his affiliation with the Nation of Islam, there was no taking it back, no saying, "Just kidding." When the sponsors fled and the media turned hostile and white America decided he'd betrayed them by choosing himself over their approval. The question wasn't whether there would be consequences. The question was whether he could live with himself if he avoided those consequences by staying silent, by being Cassius Clay forever, by letting his career be brilliant and successful and completely disconnected from who he actually was. He'd watched other black athletes navigate this. Joe Louis had been beloved because he'd been quiet, humble, unthreatening. Jackie Robinson had integrated baseball, but at the cost of agreeing not to fight back for his first years, absorbing abuse with dignity that white people found admirable because it required his silence. Those men were heroes. Genuinely, they'd opened doors. But they'd also paid a price, becoming symbols more than humans, having to represent their race perfectly because any flaw would be used as evidence of inferiority. And Cassius, standing here in this hotel room, about to walk into the biggest moment of his public life, realized he didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a person. Complicated, flawed, opinionated, free. Is freedom possible when millions of people are watching? Or does being watched always require performance? He picked up the letter from Elijah Muhammad and read it again, though he'd already memorized every word. The new name, Muhammad Ali, wasn't just a name. It was a statement. Muhammad meant worthy of praise. Ali meant elevated or exalted. Together, they formed an identity that didn't require white approval or historical connection to America's racial mythology. It was an Islamic name, connecting him to a global community of believers that transcended race and nation. It said, "I am not just an American. I am not just a Negro. I am a Muslim. I am part of something larger than the categories you've created to contain me." The name was beautiful. The name was his. But taking it meant accepting that he'd be viewed as a threat. Not because of anything he'd done, but because autonomous black identity was always viewed as threatening by people who'd grown comfortable with black people seeking their approval. Was it worth it? He looked at his reflection one more time and asked the question out loud, is being free worth losing everything? And his reflection didn't answer, because reflections can't answer, but somewhere in his chest, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, he felt something that might have been certainty. Not confidence that things would work out. He was smart enough to know they probably wouldn't, at least not in the way success was traditionally measured, but certainty that he couldn't live with himself if he chose the money and the fame over the truth of who he was. When did this young fighter from Louisville become someone who valued integrity over acceptance? Had it been gradual, or had something broken inside him the day he won Olympic gold and came home to a segregated city that still saw him as less than human? 10:45. Time to go. He stood up from the desk, leaving the sponsorship contracts on the left side, taking the letter from Elijah Muhammad and folding it carefully into his pocket. Not because he'd need to reference it during the press conference, but because having it close felt like carrying a piece of his decision with him, a physical reminder that he'd chosen. The walk from his room to the conference hall felt longer than any round he'd ever fought. Hotel hallways that should have been familiar felt strange, like he was walking through a different building. Or maybe he was just different, transformed by the decision he'd made in silence. People passed him, hotel staff, other guests, and some recognized him, offering congratulations on the fight. And he smiled and thanked them, but felt distant from the interaction, like he was watching himself from outside his body. They were congratulating Cassius Clay, but Cassius Clay was ending. In 30 minutes, he'd be someone else. Would these same people still congratulate him? Would they still smile? Or would their faces close, the way white faces had a habit of closing when black people stopped being entertaining and started being autonomous? He didn't know. But he was about to find out. The press room was packed. Reporters from every major newspaper, photographers with flash bulbs that created temporary blindness, television cameras that would broadcast whatever he said to millions of homes across America. They were expecting a celebration. The young champion basking in his unlikely victory, telling funny stories, making predictions, being the entertaining Cassius Clay they'd grown to tolerate despite finding him arrogant. Instead, they got something else. He sat down at the table, microphones crowding the space in front of him, and the question started immediately. Soft at first. How does it feel to be champion? What's next for you? Do you think Liston will demand a rematch? He answered these automatically, his mind elsewhere, waiting for the question he knew was coming. And then it came from a reporter in the back. Cassius, there are rumors you've been associating with Malcolm X and the black Muslims. Is there any truth to that? The room went quiet. Every reporter leaned forward. Every camera focused. This was the moment. And Cassius, about to stop being Cassius, took a breath and made the choice that would define the rest of his life. When you know saying yes will cost you everything, what makes you say it anyway? Is it courage, or is it just the exhaustion of pretending? His answer came out steady, clearer than he'd expected. I believe in Allah and in peace. I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want. The simplicity of it seemed to confuse the reporters more than a complicated explanation would have. Follow-up questions came rapid fire. Are you a card-carrying member? Do you support their views on white people? Are you rejecting America? Each question came with an edge, an accusation barely disguised as journalism. And with each question, he felt himself separating further from Cassius Clay, the persona who would have deflected with humor, who would have found a way to avoid giving a straight answer. Instead, Muhammad Ali, though he hadn't announced the name yet, wouldn't announce it until Elijah Muhammad officially gave it to him the next day, spoke from somewhere deeper. I'm not rejecting America. I'm rejecting the things that have been done to me and my people in America's name. I'm rejecting the idea that I have to accept a name I didn't choose. I'm rejecting the idea that being a champion means being quiet about things that matter. The room erupted, reporters shouting over each other, cameras flashing. The chaos of a moment when someone says something true that people desperately wish was false. How does it feel to watch your career implode in real time? Does knowing it's coming make it hurt less, or just differently? The next morning, the headlines confirmed what he'd known in that hotel room. He'd made himself an enemy. Cassius Clay reveals black Muslim tease. Title may be in jeopardy. Clay's shocking admission betrays American values. Is Clay a champion or a radical? The tone was uniformly condemnatory. Even journalists who'd praised his boxing now questioned his character. Sponsors called his management to cancel contracts. The World Boxing Association discussed stripping his title, not for anything he'd done in the ring, but for who he'd chosen to be outside it. And Cassius Clay, who would soon be Muhammad Ali, sat in his hotel room reading these headlines and felt not regret, but relief. Because the performance was over. The exhausting work of being acceptable, of making white people comfortable, of shrinking himself to fit into their expectations. That was done. He'd destroyed his career. Yes, he'd made enemies of powerful people, absolutely. He'd chosen the hardest possible path, without question. But for the first time in his life, he'd chosen himself, and that felt like victory in a way that no boxing match ever had. Is there a difference between winning and being free? Or is freedom just a victory that doesn't require anyone else's acknowledgement? 3 days later, Elijah Muhammad announced his new name publicly, Muhammad Ali. Not Cassius X, as some had expected, the X that Malcolm X and other nation members used to reject their slave names, but a full Islamic name, a gift from the leader himself. And with that name came a new identity that would spend the next 50 years proving that autonomy matters more than approval, that dignity is worth more than dollars, and that sometimes the greatest fight isn't against an opponent in a ring, but against a world that insists you be smaller than you are. The press refused to use the new name for years. Even sympathetic journalists would write, Cassius Clay, who now calls himself Muhammad Ali, as if his identity was a preference rather than a fact. Opponents would mock him with the old name, trying to anger him, trying to deny him the basic respect of being called what he'd chosen. And every time it happened, Ali would correct them. Calmly at first, then firmly, then angrily when calm didn't work. My name is Muhammad Ali, he'd say, over and over. To reporters, to officials, to anyone who tried to deny him this most basic thing. And eventually, slowly, the world learned. Not because they wanted to. Not because they thought he was right. But because he refused to answer to anything else. And eventually, even his enemies had to choose between calling him by his name or not being able to talk to him at all. How long does it take to force the world to see you as you are? And what does it cost to maintain that insistence year after year after year? Looking back decades later, after Ali had become possibly the most famous person on Earth, after he'd lost his title for refusing the Vietnam draft and then won it back, after he'd transcended boxing to become a global symbol of resistance and principle, that 15 minutes in a Miami Beach hotel room would be forgotten by most people. They'd remember the fights, the trash talk, the political stands, but they wouldn't remember the moment of decision, the quiet solitude before the storm, the young man sitting alone and choosing between safety and selfhood. But Ali remembered. In interviews late in his life, when Parkinson's had slowed his speech but not his mind, he'd sometimes mention it. People think the hardest fight I ever had was Foreman or Frazier. But the hardest fight was the morning I decided to stop being Cassius Clay. Because fighting another man, even the strongest man, you can train for that. You can prepare. But fighting to be yourself, against the whole world telling you not to, that's a different kind of fight. And you don't win it once. You win it every day. Every time someone tries to tell you who you should be, every time it would be easier to just go along. That's the fight that never ends. Was he right? Is identity something you claim once, or something you have to defend continuously? And if it's the latter, does that make it more or less worth having? 15 minutes. That's all it took for Cassius Clay to die and Muhammad Ali to be born. 15 minutes of silence in a hotel room while the world waited outside, unaware that the man they thought they knew was making himself into someone new. No cameras captured it. No reporters documented it. No record exists except in Ali's memory of what he thought, what he felt, what he decided in that moment alone. But everything that came after, the championship defenses, the exile, the comeback, the global fame, the status as an icon of resistance, all of it traces back to those 15 minutes when a 22-year-old fighter looked at his reflection and chose freedom over fortune, identity over acceptance, himself over everyone's expectations of who he should be. The question he asked his reflection that morning, is being free worth losing everything? He'd spend the rest of his life answering. Not with words, but with the life he lived. And the answer visible in every choice he made afterward was always the same yes. Even when it costs everything. Even when the world hates you for it. Even when you lose what you spent your whole life building.
Yes.
Because what's the alternative? Being rich and famous and successful while also being someone you're not, that's not winning. That's just a different kind of defeat. Maybe the most permanent kind. And Muhammad Ali, born in that hotel room, named 3 days later and defending that identity for the rest of his life, understood that some defeats are permanent. But so is the regret of never trying to be free. Which 15 minutes in your life defined everything that came after? And if you could go back to that moment, knowing what it would cost, would you make the same choice?